Vittorio Selvaggio had not touched a woman's hand in 40 years. Not at the private dinners, where rival bosses offered their most beautiful nieces like gift-wrap treaties. Not at the galas where senators' daughters leaned into him and whispered offers that would have made their fathers resign. Not even during the long seasons when the penthouse stretched so wide around him that his own footsteps sounded borrowed, like sounds left behind by a man who had already moved out. 60 years old, $300 million in holdings the government knew about, another figure in holdings they would never find, an empire running from the ports of Newark to the private rooms of Manhattan's most guarded establishments. And not a single woman had lasted longer than a locked door and a car sent to collect her things the next morning. The city called him the widower, though he had never been married. They called him that because every woman who entered his orbit eventually disappeared from it, and the word felt right even when the facts did not. But the woman who would change everything was already inside his house. She was on her knees in his foyer, scrubbing marble with a $3 brush, and she did not look up when his shoes clicked across the stone. Everyone looked up when Vittorio entered a room. His own consigliere, a man named Enzo Ferrara who had killed 11 people and buried 9 of them personally, still straightened his collar when Vittorio's footsteps sounded in the hallway. Waiters dropped menus. Bodyguards corrected their posture. Prosecutors suddenly needed to check their phones. But this girl, this new maid the agency had sent from Queens, kept her knees on the floor and her brush moving in long, even strokes, and she did not lift her head. Vittorio stopped walking. He looked down at the top of her head, at the dark hair pulled back in a knot coming loose at the edges, at the slope of her neck where a small scar interrupted the skin like a word scratched out of a page. He waited. 3 seconds. 5. The brush kept its rhythm on the marble. "You're new," he said. "Started Monday," she said, still not looking up. Her voice carried no weight in any direction, no deference, no challenge. She reported it the way someone reports the temperature. Vittorio watched her for another moment. Then he walked through the foyer and up the staircase to his study, and behind him, the brush kept moving against stone. Enzo Ferrara knocked at 9 sharp, the way he had for 26 years. He was 54, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been broken and reset twice, and had settled both times into something that looked like a warning carved from clay. He arrived every morning with 2 espressos and a leather folder, and he had never once been late, because Enzo understood that consistency was the only loyalty Vittorio trusted. "The Petrov situation," Enzo said, setting down the folder. "They're pushing into Coney Island. 2 of their men showed up at Dimitri's restaurant last night, sat at the bar, ordered nothing, stayed 3 hours. How did Dimitri handle it?" "He called us." "Good. Set a meeting with their man Gregor, the place on Mulberry. Tell him 1 associate, I choose the table. And if Gregor brings more than 1. Vittorio turned his espresso cup in a slow circle on the saucer. The porcelain scraped against porcelain with a sound like a fingernail drawn across silk. "Then we'll have a longer conversation." Enzo nodded. He knew what a longer conversation meant. He had been present for most of them over 26 years, and they always ended the same way, with Enzo making phone calls and someone's family receiving flowers they had not expected. "Who's the new girl?" Vittorio said. Enzo looked up from his notes. "Which new girl?" "The one on the foyer floor. She didn't look at me when I walked past." Enzo paused, reading the temperature of the statement. "Sierra Calloway, 25. Agency sent her last week. Clean background. No debts, no priors, no affiliations. I ran her twice." She didn't look up, Enzo. "You want me to let her go?" "No." Vittorio picked up his espresso. "I want to know why she didn't." Before the week was out, Vittorio had his answer to the Petrov question, and he delivered it in person. The meeting with Gregor took place at the restaurant on Mulberry, a place Vittorio's family had owned since before he was born. The dining room was closed to the public. 3 of Vittorio's men stood at the perimeter. Enzo sat to Vittorio's right with his hands folded on the white tablecloth, perfectly still, the way a loaded weapon is still. Gregor Petrov was 40, wide-necked, with the sunburned confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He brought one associate as requested, and he sat across from Vittorio with the posture of someone who believed this was a negotiation between equals. It was not. Coney Island has been neutral ground for 8 years, Vittorio said. Your father and I agreed on that. Your father shook my hand. My father is retired, Gregor said. I run things now. The landscape has changed. The landscape doesn't change, Gregor. The landscape is the landscape. What changes is how much respect people bring to the table. Vittorio folded his napkin and set it beside his plate with the precision of someone placing a period at the end of a sentence. Your men sat in Dimitri's restaurant for 3 hours and ordered nothing. That's not a business move. That's a teenager marking a locker. Gregor's associate shifted in his chair. Gregor himself did not move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. I want Coney Island, Gregor said. The boardwalk concessions, the real estate pipeline, the construction contracts, all of it. I know what you want, and I'm going to explain to you once why you're not going to get it. Vittorio leaned forward, not far, an inch, but the inch closed something in the room that could not be reopened. Your father built something respectable. He was a serious man. He understood boundaries. You are not a serious man yet, Gregor. You are a man who inherited a seat at a table and mistook the seat for the table itself. So here is what happens. Your men leave Coney Island by Friday. You call Dimitri personally and apologize for the discourtesy. And the next time you want to discuss territory with me, you request a meeting through proper channels, the way your father taught you. And if I don't? Vittorio looked at him. The look lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Gregor Petrov saw something he had only heard described in stories other men told when they thought no one important was listening. It was not anger. Anger was negotiable. What sat behind Vittorio's eyes was the absolute absence of hesitation. I don't repeat offers, Vittorio said. And I don't make threats, I make plans. The difference is that a threat requires your cooperation. A plan does not. Gregor left the restaurant 14 minutes later. His associate walked 3 steps behind instead of beside him, which told Vittorio everything about how the conversation had landed. By Thursday, Dimitri reported the Petrov men had cleared out. By Friday, Gregor called Enzo to formally apologize. Vittorio never raised his voice. He never touched a weapon. He never stood from his chair. The most dangerous things in the room had been a napkin fold and a 4-second look, and both had been sufficient. This was the man Sierra Calloway did not look up for. For 2 weeks, Vittorio studied her the way he studied everyone who entered his world. Carefully, from the periphery of his attention, where people believed they were invisible. She arrived at 6 every morning through the service entrance, changed in the staff room, began her rotation through the estate's 22 rooms with a precision that suggested either military training or something forged in a harder school. She spoke to other staff when spoken to and did not initiate conversations. She ate lunch alone in the kitchen, always the same meal, rice and whatever protein remained from the night before, and she read paperback books with the covers torn off so the titles stayed hidden. She did not steal, she did not gossip, she did not linger. She moved through the estate like water through a pipe, consistent and purposeful, and at 4 o'clock she changed and disappeared back into Queens. The other maids watched Vittorio the way rabbits watch the sky for hawks, with a permanent flinch built into the architecture of their shoulders. One of them, Patris, who had been with the household for 9 years, once spilled a glass of water when Vittorio rounded a corner unexpectedly. She spent 45 minutes in the utility closet afterward. Sierra did none of this. When Vittorio entered a room she was cleaning, she continued cleaning. When he sat in his study while she dusted the shelves behind him, she dusted the shelves behind him. When he left his coffee cup on the edge of the bathroom sink, she picked it up and washed it and returned it to the kitchen without comment. He began leaving the cup in different places. The windowsill of the library, the arm of the leather chair. Once, on the 3rd step of the main staircase, balanced on the edge so it would fall if anyone brushed past carelessly. She found it every time. She never mentioned it. She never adjusted her route. On the 15th day, he spoke to her again. She was cleaning the windows in the west gallery, the long hallway lined with landscapes his mother had collected before her death. The windows ran floor to ceiling and looked out over the garden, where 3 groundskeepers maintained roses they were privately terrified of neglecting. "You read during your lunch," he said from the doorway. Her cloth paused on the glass for half a second. "Yes." "What do you read?" "Books." "I can see they're books. What kind?" She turned and looked at him. Full on, the way people who owed him money never could. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black at the rims, and there was nothing soft in them. Nothing hard, either. They were the eyes of someone who had stopped being startled by things a long time ago, and Vittorio recognized that flatness because he had built the same thing into his own face decades earlier, and he knew what it cost. "Histories," she said, "mostly." "Of what?" "People who thought they were permanent." She went back to the window. Vittorio stood in the doorway and felt something turn over inside his chest, rusted and reluctant, an engine that had not been asked to start in years. He walked away without a word. The shift started so slowly that he did not recognize it as a shift. He told himself he was curious, which was half true. He told himself the library had better morning light than the study, which was a lie so transparent that even the furniture knew. Sira cleaned the library between 8 and 9. So between 8 and 9, Vittorio sat in the leather armchair by the window with his espresso and his newspapers, and he did not look at Sira directly, and she did not look at him, and they shared the room with the deliberate non-attention of 2 people working very hard at not paying attention to each other. "What are you reading now?" he asked on a Tuesday. She held up the coverless paperback. "Suetonius, the 12 Caesars." "Heavy for a Tuesday." "All mornings are heavy. Tuesdays have nothing to do with it." He turned a page of his newspaper. "Which Caesar?" "Tiberius, the one who retired to Capri and let the empire run itself." "Did it work?" "What do you think?" Vittorio folded the newspaper on his knee. "I think a man who builds something and then walks away was never building for the right reasons." Her cloth stopped moving. She looked at him and something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition. "That's an interesting thing for you to say," she said. "Why?" "Because you've built things your whole life, and you live in this house alone." The sentence landed between them and stayed there. Vittorio felt it arrive in the center of his chest and settle against something he had been protecting for 4 decades. "You should be careful about what you say to me," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "You should be careful about what you ask." She turned back to the shelf. "You keep starting conversations you're not ready to finish." He sat with the newspaper unread and the espresso growing cold and nothing to put in the space she had opened. She was right. He was starting conversations he could not complete. The question was whether he would ever learn how. In October, Vittorio held a dinner for 8 of his captains and their wives. These quarterly dinners were performances designed to maintain loyalty through the illusion of family. Sira was on the serving rotation that night. She moved through the dining room in the black staff uniform with the balanced stride of someone who had carried heavier things than plates. Glasses were refilled at the precise moment they needed it. She navigated the table the way a surgeon navigates tissue, touching nothing unnecessary. Then Carmine Russo opened his mouth. Carmine was 58, ran the family's construction interests in the Bronx, and had been with Vittorio long enough to believe tenure meant permission. He treated service staff like furniture that could hear. "Sweetheart," he said as Sira placed his plate, "you missed a spot." He pointed at a bead of sauce the size of a pinhead on the rim. Sira lifted the plate, wiped the rim with a cloth from her apron, set it back down. "Better," Carmine said. He leaned toward his wife, Tessa, and said something he believed was too quiet to carry. Vittorio read it off his lips. He had taught himself lip-reading in prison 35 years ago and had never stopped. What Carmine said was crude. It involved Sira's age, Vittorio's long absence from women, and a suggestion about what services the new maid might be providing beyond housekeeping. Sira's face registered nothing. She turned and walked to the kitchen as if Carmine Russo were furniture that could talk but not think. After dinner, the captain's gone. Vittorio stood on the back terrace smoking one of his 3 daily cigarettes. The kitchen door opened. Footsteps on stone, lighter than Enzo's, steadier than anyone else's. "Mr. Selvaggio, kitchen is closed. Anything else before I leave?" "What did Carmine say to you?" A pause. "He said I missed a spot." "And after that?" A longer pause. "I don't know what you mean." "You heard what he said to his wife, and you kept walking." "Does it matter what he said?" "It matters to me." "Why?" The word hung in the cold air. Nobody asked Vittorio Selvaggio why. People asked when and how much and where, and they accepted whatever came back. He turned around. She was 4 feet away, coat buttoned to her throat, bag over one shoulder. "Because anyone who disrespects you in my house disrespects me," he said. "With respect, Mr. Selvaggio, I've been disrespected by men who made Carmine Russo look like a greeting card, and I'm still standing here." The words carried no heat, but Vittorio heard the weight beneath them, the compression of something lived and carried and never set down. This was not bravado. This was testimony. "How old are you, Sira?" 25. "You talk like you're older." "And you act like you're younger, leaving your coffee cup on the staircase to see if I'll pick it up." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. A fracture, the first crack in a wall that had been standing for 40 years. "You knew," he said. "Since the second time you did it." She pulled her coat tighter. "Good night, Mr. Selvaggio." She walked through the kitchen door. Vittorio stood on the terrace with his cigarette burning to the filter, and he stood there long after the cherry died, because nobody had caught him at something in decades, and the feeling it produced needed time to locate in his body. The next morning, Vittorio called Carmine to the restaurant on Mulberry. Same table where Gregor Petrov had learned about the difference between threats and plans. Carmine arrived, sweating through his overcoat. "You made a comment about my maid," Vittorio said. "At my table, in my house, while eating food I paid for." "Vittorio, come on, I was talking to Tessa. It was nothing. You know how." "You're going to write a letter of apology and deliver it to the estate. Stand in front of Sira Calloway and read it aloud. Then you leave and you never speak about her again. Not to your wife, not to your men, not to the walls of your bathroom." Carmine's face cycled through several calculations, all arriving at the same answer. "She's a maid, Vittorio, she's." "Finish that sentence." Carmine did not finish the sentence. The letter arrived 3 days later. Carmine read it aloud in the foyer, hands shaking hard enough that the paper rattled against itself. Sira stood with her arms at her sides and her face showing nothing. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Russo." Carmine left the estate with the face of a man who had narrowly avoided something he would spend years trying to understand. That evening, Sira found Vittorio in the library. He was at the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the garden lights kick on in sequence. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." "He's one of your captains, 30 years with you. You humiliated him over a comment about a maid." "Over a comment about you, there's a difference." She stepped into the room. The lamplight caught the scar on her neck, a thin white line that interrupted the skin like a word crossed out of a page. Vittorio had noticed it the first day. He had not asked about it, because he understood that some scars answer to no one. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for weeks. One more won't change the pattern. The way you don't react, the way nothing lands on your face. I've seen soldiers with less control than you. Where did you learn that?" Something moved behind Sira's composure. Not a crack. A shudder, deep and brief, the way a building shudders when a truck passes too close to the foundation. "My father," she said. Vittorio waited. Silence pulled more truth from people than questions ever could. "He was not a criminal," she continued. "He was not powerful or rich. He was a locksmith in the Bronx who came home every night and sat in his chair and waited for someone in the house to give him a reason." She paused. Her hand went to the strap of her bag and tightened around it, knuckles pressing white against brown skin. A dish in the sink was a reason. A light left on was a reason. Looking at him too long was a reason. Not looking at him long enough was a reason. Sierra, you learn when you grow up in a house like that to control your face. Flinching is an invitation. Crying is a target. The safest thing you can be is still. Perfectly, completely still. Because a man like my father reads movement the way a predator reads movement, and the only way to survive a predator is to stop looking like prey. The scar, he said. Belt buckle. I was 9. He said I looked at him wrong during dinner. Where is he now? I don't know. My mother left him when I was 16. She worked in a garment factory until it closed, then a register at a bodega. Then she got sick. Sierra's hand loosened on the strap. She died when I was 22. I've been on my own since. Vittorio looked at her across the library, across the distance of 35 years and the gap between their worlds, and he saw something he had not expected. He saw the same architecture, not the power or the money or the empire, the thing underneath. The child who had learned to stop flinching because flinching drew blood, and who had carried that lesson forward into adulthood and built a life on the scar tissue. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be, I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think you already know what it costs to learn what I learned. You carry it in a penthouse instead of a studio apartment, but the weight is the same. She left. Vittorio sat in his chair and did not open a newspaper, and did not drink his espresso, and did not call in Zoe, because his days looked different now, held up against the light of what she had handed him. That night, in her studio apartment in Astoria, Sierra sat on the floor with her back against the radiator and Scipio in her lap. The apartment was 400 square feet. The radiator clanked. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like a country she could never identify. The bookshelves along the far wall held every book she had read since her mother died. 87 paperbacks arranged by era, ancient to modern, covers intact on the ones she had bought new. Covers torn from the ones she had pulled from free bins outside used bookstores, because the covers had other people's coffee rings on them, and she could not stand to look at evidence of someone else's carelessness. Scipio purred against her stomach. She scratched behind his ears and looked at the ceiling and replayed what she had told Vittorio. She had given him her father, the belt buckle, the scar, the calculus of stillness she had learned at 9 and never unlearned. She had given these things to a man who ran a criminal empire, and the giving had not felt dangerous. It had felt like setting down a bag she had been carrying up a flight of stairs that never ended. That was the part that scared her, not Vittorio's world, not the bodyguards or the whispered reputation or the locked doors. What scared her was that she had spent 3 years since her mother's death building a life that needed no one, an apartment with one chair, a routine that required no coordination, a job that exchanged labor for money with no emotional transaction attached. And in 6 weeks, a 60-year-old man with sad eyes and a coffee cup game had walked through every wall she had built, and she had let him, and she wanted him to keep going. She pressed her face against Scipio's fur. He smelled like kibble and radiator dust and the particular warmth of a small animal who does not know that the world is complicated. I'm in trouble, she said to the cat. Scipio purred louder. You're no help, she said. She went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and listened to the apartment building breathe around her, pipes and footsteps and someone's television playing through the wall, and she thought about Vittorio's face when she told him about her father. The way his expression had not shifted into sympathy, the way it had shifted into recognition. As if she had described a room he had been living in his entire life, and he was hearing someone else say the address out loud for the first time. She rolled onto her side and pulled the blanket to her chin and closed her eyes, and the last thing she saw before sleep took her was the library window and the man sitting in the chair beneath it, holding a newspaper he was not reading, pretending he was not watching her the way she was pretending she was not watching him. After that night, the pretenses thinned and dissolved. She started calling him Vittorio. He did not correct her. He asked the kitchen to prepare a second espresso in the mornings, and Sira drank it standing by the library window while he sat in his chair, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with cleaning or crime. She told him about Scipio, who lived in her apartment and judged her reading choices from the top of the refrigerator. He asked which Scipio, and she said Africanus, obviously, and the word obviously carried a warmth he had not heard from her before, the warmth of someone who has been understood without having to explain. He told her about the first time he killed a man. He was 22. The man had owed his father money and tried to pay with bad information. His father handed him a gun and said one word: learn. He told it flat and clean, and Sira listened with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, her hands wrapped around the espresso cup, her eyes on his face. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "I regret that I didn't feel anything when I did it. I was 22 and I pulled the trigger, and it was the same as shutting a door. The fact that it scares you means you're not who you think you are." "Who do I think I am?" "Your father's son." The mornings became the architecture of something neither of them named. They did not touch. They did not close the distance between the chair and the window. But Vittorio felt the charge in his hands and his throat and along the back of his neck, a physical awareness of where she stood in relation to him at all times, as if his body had started mapping her position the way it had spent decades mapping threats. When she reached past him to dust the shelf above his chair, her sleeve brushed his shoulder, and the contact lasted a quarter of a second, and he felt it for the rest of the day. A strip of warmth on his skin that would not cool. When she stood at the window and the morning light came through and caught the line of her jaw and the column of her throat, Vittorio looked at her and then looked away. And the looking away was harder than anything he had done in a boardroom or a back alley, because looking away required him to override something that had stopped listening to his instructions. The night he told her about Gianna was the night the axis broke. December. The estate held cold in pockets, warm near the radiators and frigid in the hallways. Sira had stayed late. Vittorio had been in his study with bourbon and a letter from a federal prosecutor. Neither had planned to meet in the hallway, but the hallway was where they met, outside the locked door at the end of the West Gallery. The door was walnut, installed by Vittorio's grandfather in 1932. The lock required a key Vittorio wore on a chain around his neck, against his skin. No staff had ever been instructed about this room. They had simply been told it did not exist. Sira was standing 3 feet from the door, not touching it, not trying the handle, standing with her head tilted as if listening for something on the other side. "What are you doing?" Vittorio said. She turned. "I've cleaned every room in this house except this one. It's the only door I've never been asked to open. There's a reason. There's a reason for everything you do." He walked toward her. The hallway was narrow, close now, close enough to see the pulse in her throat, steady and slow. "If I told you what was behind this door," he said, "you would not look at me the same way. Try me." He should have walked away. Every instinct he had built over 6 decades told him to go back to the study and pour another bourbon and let the door stay locked. Instead, he reached under his collar and pulled the chain over his head and held the key in his palm. "Her name was Gianna," he said. "She was 19 when I married her. I was 20. We had 4 months. He turned the key. The door opened onto a room that had not been aired in 40 years. Small, a single curtained window, a narrow bed still made, a dresser with a clouded mirror. On the dresser, a photograph in a silver frame, a wooden brush with dark hairs still caught in the bristles, a perfume bottle with the label peeling, and a pair of earrings laid on a square of cloth as if someone had taken them off and expected to put them back on in the morning. The room smelled like closed air and old wood, and something faint underneath. Something sweet and fatting that might have been perfume, or might have been the house holding a memory it could not release. Sira stood beside him in the doorway. She did not enter. She did not speak. She let the room say what it needed to say. "My father killed her," Vittorio said. He was looking at the photograph, at a face that had blurred in his memory over the decades until he needed this photograph to reconstruct it, and that erosion, the slow loss of her features from the inside of his eyelids, was worse than the original loss in ways he had never spoken aloud. January 14th, 1986. She was 20, 4 months married. My father told me love was a vulnerability. He was not a man who left vulnerabilities standing. He killed her to teach you a lesson, Sierra said. Her voice had dropped into a register she kept for things that carried weight. To teach me that the family comes first, that anyone I loved would become a weapon against me, and he proved it. He closed the door and locked it and put the chain back around his neck, and his hands were steady because he had practiced steadiness for 4 decades. 40 years inside that lesson, he said. No woman gets close, no one sees the room, no one hears her name. And now I've heard all 3. Now you've heard all 3. Why? He looked at her in the dim hallway, the sconce above them casting amber light across her face. Because you're the first person since Gianna who treated me like a human being, not a boss, not a threat, not a legend. You picked up my coffee cup and talked to me about dead emperors and you never flinched. Every woman in 40 years was either trying to get something from me or afraid of what I might take. You did neither. Sierra was quiet for a long time. The house settled around them, radiators ticking. I'm going to say something, she said, and you're not going to like it. I rarely like the things worth hearing. Your father didn't teach you that love was weakness. Your father taught you that he was willing to murder a 20-year-old girl to keep you obedient. Those are different lessons, and you've been learning the wrong one for 40 years. The words landed low and center. They rearranged the contents of a space he had kept sealed longer than the room behind the walnut door. Nobody had ever separated the lesson from the teacher. Nobody had shown him that the lesson was wrong because the man who delivered it was not teaching strength. He was teaching submission. You should go home, Vittorio said. Sierra did not push. She did not comfort. She picked up her coat and left through the service entrance, and the door closed with a sound that was small and absolute. Vittorio pressed his hand against the hallway wall because his legs had stopped following instructions. He stood there until the radiator went quiet and his breathing was the only sound left. Then he went to the study and poured a bourbon and did not drink it. He sat with the glass catching lamplight and let himself feel, for the first time in 4 decades, the full dimension of what had been taken. Not Gianna, not the marriage, not the 4 months. The ability to love someone without waiting for the punishment. The first time he kissed her was in January, in the kitchen, and nothing about it was cinematic. The staff had gone home. Sierra had stayed to reorganize the pantry, a project she had assigned herself because the existing system was, in her words, an insult to the concept of alphabetical order. Vittorio came down for water and found her on a step stool with her arms full of canned tomatoes. She turned too fast. The cans slipped. He stepped forward and caught her instead. She came off the stool and into his arms with the artless momentum of someone who was not expecting to fall, and his hands went to her waist, and she looked up at him from 6 inches, and the kitchen was flooded with fluorescent light, and there was nothing beautiful about the setting except everything about the moment. His heart was beating in a way it had not beaten since 1985. He could feel her breathing against his chest, fast and shallow, and her hands had landed on his arms when she fell and they stayed there, fingers pressing into the fabric of his shirt, and neither of them moved to separate. Vittorio, she said. His name in her mouth sounded like a door swinging open after a long time locked. I'm going to kiss you, he said, and I need you to tell me if that's what you want, because I have spent 40 years not asking anyone what they want, and I am trying to learn. Her hand came up and settled against his jaw. Her thumb found the line of his cheekbone and traced it, and the touch registered less as pressure and more as temperature, warm where she met his skin, spreading outward and downward. I've been waiting, she said, for you to ask. He kissed her, slow and deliberate. She tasted like espresso and something clean and green, and her hand tightened on his jaw, and his hands tightened at her waist, and the fluorescent light buzzed above them. When they pulled apart, her hand stayed on his face. Her composure showed not cracks but windows, places where the steadiness opened onto something warm and running underneath. "You're shaking," she said. "I haven't done this in 40 years. Then we go slow." "I don't know slow. I know how to not do something, and I know how to do it completely." "Then we do it completely." Her thumb moved across his cheekbone again, "and we figure out the speed together." Enzo knew before Vittorio told him. 26 years of reading Vittorio's behavior had made him a seismologist of his boss's interior life, and the shift from January onward registered as a significant event. "You're sleeping better," Enzo said one morning, setting down the espressos. "Jaws not locked when you wake up, down to 2 cigarettes, and you smiled at the chef yesterday, which I think genuinely frightened him." "Your point." "It's the girl. Her name is Sira." "Vittorio," Enzo sat down and folded his hands. "She's 25, you're 60, she's staff, you're the head of this family. If this gets out, people will see her as leverage." The word landed between them. Leverage, the same word Vittorio's father had used about Gianna. "That's what my father said about Gianna," Vittorio said. "He called her leverage, then he proved it." "I'm not your father. I'm saying this because I've kept you alive for 26 years, and I'd prefer to continue." "Then keep her alive too." Enzo looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and opened his folder. In March, the phone call came. The voice was thin and papery, filtered through medical tubing and institutional air, and hearing it put a hand around Vittorio's windpipe. "Vittorio," his father said. Salvatore Selvaggio was 87 and was supposed to be dead. He had been supposed to be dead for 12 years, since the night Vittorio drove him to a facility upstate and told the staff that this patient was to be comfortable, was to have no outside contact, and was to exist, for all purposes, as a dead man. Vittorio had not killed his father. This was the one mercy he had allowed himself. "How did you get a phone?" he said. "I've always had my ways." "What do you want?" "I hear there's a girl, young, a maid. I'm told you're behaving like a man who has forgotten the most important lesson of his life." Vittorio walked to the window. Early spring bulbs were pushing through the garden soil, green shoots arriving on schedule. "If you touch her," Vittorio said, "if you send anyone near her, if you say her name." "You'll what? Come finish what you should have finished 12 years ago. You're soft, Vittorio. You were soft at 20 and you're soft at 60, and this girl will prove it the same way Gianna proved it." Vittorio hung up. He called Enzo. "My father is making calls. Find out who gave him a phone. Find out who's feeding him information about this house. And put additional security on Sira, starting now." He did not tell Sira about the call. He told himself he was protecting her. The real reason was that he was afraid of what she would say. She would see through his logic the way she always did, and she would tell him something he was not ready for. 2 weeks later, he came home from Manhattan and found the estate locked down. Extra cars in the driveway, armed men at the gates. Enzo on the front steps with his phone in one hand and a look on his face that Vittorio had only seen before someone died. 2 men approached Sira at the subway this morning, didn't touch her, handed her an envelope. "Where is she?" "Library." Vittorio went inside. His stride covered the hallway and half the steps it should have, and when he opened the library door, Sira was sitting in his chair. His chair. She was holding a piece of paper in both hands, and she was very still in the way she got still when the alternative was coming apart. It was a photograph. Old, faded, 1980s printing. A young man in a dark suit and a young woman in a white dress, standing in front of a church, both wearing the stunned, grateful look of people who could not believe their luck. Vittorio and Gianna, their wedding day. On the back, in handwriting, Vittorio recognized the way you recognize your own pulse. 3 words. "Remember the lesson." Sira set the photograph on the chair arm. Her face had changed, not into something soft, into something that carried the weight of reckoning. "Who sent this?" she said. "My father. The man who killed your wife." "Yes." The man you told me was dead. The room split down the center. Vittorio felt the fracture run through everything they had built. I didn't say he was dead. I said he killed Gianna. I never told you. You let me believe it. You let me walk through this house for months, hearing stories about what he did, and the whole time he was alive, watching. She stood up from the chair. And you knew, and you kept it from me. Her voice was climbing now, and for the first time since he had known her, the fortress she had built out of a childhood in her father's house was shaking, and what came through the cracks was not calm or measured. Your father killed your wife to prove love makes you weak, and now you're keeping secrets from the woman you love to protect her. Do you hear yourself? It's not the same. It is exactly the same. She stepped toward him. The mechanism is identical. Someone you love becomes a problem to manage instead of a person to be honest with. Your father managed Gianna by killing her. You're managing me by lying. The scale is different. The logic is the same. And I know that logic, Vittorio. I grew up inside it. My father managed my mother by keeping her afraid. He managed me by keeping me small. And I spent my entire life getting free of that, and I will not. Her voice caught. Her jaw tightened. She forced the next words through the tightness. I will not walk into another version of it, not even yours, not even for you. Her voice broke on the last word, not dramatically. The way a branch breaks when the weight has been accumulating for years, and the final ounce is something that should not have been enough. Vittorio stood in the doorway and felt every word land where it was aimed. Every woman before me, Sira said, and her voice was steadier now, rebuilt with the speed of someone who has had a lifetime of practice at reconstruction. The socialites, the gifts, the ones Enzo screened. They were afraid of you, or they wanted your name, or they wanted the story. None of them challenged you. None of them stood in this room and said the thing you needed to hear. She closed the distance to the point where he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes and the scar on her neck, and the way her pulse had jumped from its usual metronome into something urgent and racing. Here is what no woman ever dared, she said. I am not leaving. Your father sent that photograph to scare me, and I looked at it and I saw a 20-year-old boy who was happy for 4 months before someone decided his happiness was a threat. I am standing here telling you that I am not a threat. I am not leverage. I am not a lesson. I am a person who loves you, and if you want me gone, you will have to look me in the face and say you don't love me back, and you will have to mean it. Vittorio Selvaggio had stared down prosecutors. He had walked into rooms where every person present wanted him dead and walked out with his pulse unchanged. He had built an empire from blood and limestone and held it for 40 years. He could not hold her gaze. His eyes dropped. His hands came up and pressed against his face, and his shoulders curved forward into a posture so foreign on his frame that it looked like his body was trying to fold into a shape it had never attempted. I can't say it, he said. I've been trying to build that sentence for weeks. Every night I construct it, and every morning I look at you and it disappears. He lowered his hands. His eyes were wet. The last time that had happened, Gianna had been alive. But I can't let what happened to her happen to you. The thought of it stops my breathing. Then we stop him, together. Not you managing a situation while I wait in the dark, together. She took his face in both hands. Her palms were warm and rough with work, and they held him from underneath, the way foundations hold things, without performance. Let me in, she said. All the way, not the library, not the kitchen. The locked room, the phone calls, the father upstate, everything. Because I didn't fall in love with a version of you with its edges sanded down. I fell in love with the man who's terrified and honest and standing in a doorway trying to protect me from something I'm not afraid of. His hand came up and covered hers. His fingers closed around hers with the careful pressure of someone holding something that has just agreed to stay. Okay, he said, okay. The confrontation with Salvatore happened in April. Sira insisted on being there. Vittorio had promised all the way in, and he kept his word, even when keeping it meant walking into a room with a man who had proven 40 years earlier that hearts could be stopped. The facility was 3 hours north, in a stretch of upstate New York where the trees pressed close to the road. It looked like a wealthy retiree's country home from outside. You had to notice the cameras in the eaves and the reinforced windows to know otherwise. Enzo drove. 4 men followed in a second car. Sierra sat beside Vittorio and held his hand the entire drive, her thumb moving in slow circles across his knuckles. Neither of them spoke. Salvatore Selvaggio was in a wheelchair in a sunroom at the rear of the house. He was thin the way old predators get thin, the flesh retreating but the architecture holding. The jaw still sharp. The eyes still carrying the intelligence that had built the Selvaggio empire before Vittorio was born. He looked at his son. He looked at Sierra. His mouth arranged itself into something that resembled a smile the way a scalpel resembles a letter opener. "So this is the Maid," Salvatore said. "She's pretty, they were all pretty. Gianna was pretty too. How long do you think this one lasts?" "Her name is Sierra," Vittorio said. "I don't care about her name. Names are for people who survive." Sierra released Vittorio's hand. She walked forward, past the bodyguards, past Enzo, past the aide beside the wheelchair. She stopped 3 feet from the old man and looked down at him. "You killed his wife because you were afraid," Sierra said. The sunroom went silent. "I killed his wife because she was making him soft," Salvatore said. "A soft man in our business is a dead man, everything I built. You killed her because she loved him and he loved her back, and you saw something in that love you never had the courage to build for yourself. You saw your son choosing someone over the family, and you couldn't stand it. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was a freedom you never had." Salvatore's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out beneath parchment skin. "You don't know anything about me, girl. I know you've been in this room for 12 years. I know your son put you here because he couldn't bring himself to do what you would have done, which means the part of him you spent his whole life trying to kill is still alive. That's not weakness. That's the one thing you tried hardest to destroy, surviving anyway." Salvatore looked past Sierra to Vittorio. Vittorio stood near the doorway with Enzo at his shoulder, his face stone, his eyes wet. The combination was the most honest expression he had worn in 4 decades. "She's going to get you killed," Salvatore said. "No," Vittorio said. "Gianna didn't get me killed. You killed Gianna. That was your choice. This is mine." Salvatore's mouth pulled into a thin line, then it curved, not at Vittorio, at Enzo. "Tell him," Salvatore said. The room shifted. Everyone felt it. The bodyguards, the aide, Sierra, and Vittorio, who turned to look at the man who had been at his right hand for 26 years. Enzo's face had gone blank, not the blank of composure, the blank of a man whose cover has been stripped away in a room with no exits. "Tell him what?" Vittorio said. "Tell him who gave me the phone," Salvatore said. "Tell him who's been giving me reports on his household for 12 years. Tell him who told me about the girl." Outside, a bird was singing in a tree near the window. The sound was obscene in its ordinariness. Vittorio looked at Enzo. Enzo, who had arrived every morning at 9 for 26 years, who had carried 2 espressos and a leather folder, who had been present for every decision, every strategy, every longer conversation, who had doubled Sierra's security detail, who had said, with his hands folded and his voice steady, "I've kept you alive for 26 years. "Is it true?" Vittorio said. Enzo's throat worked. His hands, which had been folded in front of him the way they always were, separated and fell to his sides. "He's your father, Vittorio." "Is it true?" "He asked me to watch, to report. I never acted against you, I never." "You told him about Sierra." "I told him you had a new staff member. I didn't know he would." "You watched me open a door I had kept locked for 40 years. Vittorio's voice had gone to the place it went during the longer conversations, the place below anger where the air was thin and cold and every word cost something. "You watched me trust someone for the first time since I was 20, and you reported it to the man who killed the last woman I trusted." Enzo said nothing. The mathematics of the betrayal were simple and complete. Salvatore was smiling the smile of a man who has played his final card and does not care whether it wins because the game itself was the point. "You see," Salvatore said, "this is what I've been trying to teach you. Trust is a fairy tale. The man who stood beside you for 26 years was mine the entire time. The only safe position is alone. The room waited. It waited the way rooms always waited for Vittorio, with the understanding that whatever happened next would be his decision. But Sira moved first. She turned from Salvatore and walked to Vittorio and took his hand, not gently. She took it with the grip of someone who understands that some moments require force. "He wants you to do what you've always done," she said, low and fierce and meant for him alone. "He wants you to lock down, push everyone out, prove him right. Every person in this room is waiting for you to become the man your father built, and if you do, he wins. Not because he outsmarted you, because he outlasted you." Vittorio looked at her hand gripping his, then at her face, then at the room, his father in the wheelchair, Enzo with his arms at his sides and his life collapsing. "You are not him," Sira said. "The proof is that you are standing here holding my hand instead of doing what he would do." Vittorio squeezed her hand. He turned to Enzo. "Go home," he said. "Your things will be at your apartment by tonight. If I see you again, we will have the conversation you've been helping me have with other people for 26 years. Enzo nodded. His eyes were wet. He opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. "For what it's worth," Enzo said, "the 26 years were real, everything except this." "That's what makes it unforgivable," Vittorio said. "Go." Enzo left. His footsteps echoed down the stone hallway, growing fainter, and with each step, 26 years of mornings and espressos and leather folders were erased like chalk from a board. Vittorio turned to his father. "You planted a man in my life for 26 years, he said. Watched me through his eyes, waited for the moment I was most vulnerable and used it." He took a step toward the wheelchair. "And it doesn't matter, because the thing you're trying to prove is wrong. It has always been wrong. I am standing here with this woman and I am not weaker. I am the most dangerous I have ever been, because for the first time in 40 years I have something worth protecting. And a man with something worth protecting will do things a man with nothing will not." Salvatore opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His jaw worked, but the machinery behind it had stalled, and for the first time in the memory of anyone present, Vittorio Selvaggio had no words. His hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair, knuckles white, the tendons standing out like cables beneath skin, so thin it looked like it might tear. He looked like a man watching the single idea he had built his entire life around be dismantled in front of him, and finding that he had nothing behind it. No second argument, no backup position, just the wheelchair and the window and the long quiet of a room that would hold him for however many years he had left. Vittorio took Sira's hand. They walked out of the sunroom, through the stone hallway, past the cameras and the reinforced windows, into the April afternoon where the air smelled like cut grass and wet soil. In the car, Sira fell asleep against his shoulder. Her weight settled against him with the unconscious trust of someone who has decided where she belongs, and Vittorio sat still so as not to wake her, and he pressed his lips against the top of her head. The wedding was in June, 14 people, the estate garden roses in full bloom. Sira wore white, bought off a rack in Brooklyn. Vittorio wore charcoal. A judge officiated. No priest. Sira had wanted that, and Vittorio had not argued. His vows were written on a napkin at 3 a.m. and abandoned at the altar, because the truth was not as neat as the napkin version. "I have been a locked room for 40 years, he said, holding her hands. "You walked into my house and you did not knock. You picked up the thing I left on the floor to test you and put it back where it belonged, and you did it every day until I understood the test was about me, not you. Whether I could stop testing and start trusting. I trust you, with the room, with the key, with everything I spent my life hiding." Sira's vows were 2 sentences. "I came to clean your house," she said. "I stayed to clean the rest." He kissed her in the garden with June light coming through the roses and 14 people pretending they were not crying, and nobody pretending this was normal, because it was not. It was a man who had been locked for 40 years standing in a garden with the key around a woman's neck, and the door was open, and he was not afraid. That night, he unlocked the room at the end of the West Gallery for the last time. He carried Gianna's photograph into the garden, and Sira sat beside him on the stone bench while he held it. "Thank you," he said to the photograph. to Gianna, to the 19-year-old girl who had married a boy who did not know what was coming. The first person who proved there was something living inside his chest, even if it took 4 decades and a second woman to prove the first one right. He set the photograph down on the bench. Then he reached behind his neck and unclasped the chain. The key hung from it, the key he had worn against his skin for 40 years. He held it in his palm. It was warm from his body. He took Sierra's hand and turned it over and placed the key in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "There's nothing left to lock," he said. Sierra looked at the key in her hand. She looked at the man who had carried it for 4 decades against his chest, above his heart, a small piece of metal that had been the heaviest thing he owned. Her fingers tightened around it, and she pulled him toward her by the front of his shirt and kissed him. And the kiss was not gentle, and it was not slow, and it was the kiss of a woman who had spent her whole life learning to be still and had finally found the one person worth moving for. The garden was dark. The roses were black shapes against a blacker sky. Manhattan glowed on the southern horizon like a city that did not know it had lost its most dangerous man to a 25-year-old with a $3 brush and a cat named after a Roman general.